The fever had taken hold of Margaret Fletcher 3 days before Yates Emerson arrived at her family's cabin, and by then, her skin burned hotter than any summer sun that ever blazed over Aurora, Nevada. It was the spring of 1872, and the silver mines had brought prosperity to some but hardship to many in this rugged territory, where the Sierra Nevada mountains met endless stretches of high desert. Margaret's father had died 2 winters past in a mining accident, leaving her and her younger brother Thomas to manage their small homestead on the outskirts of town. At 22, Margaret had grown accustomed to hard work, to the calluses on her palms and the constant worry that accompanied frontier life. She had never expected to find herself helpless, burning with sickness while her 14-year-old brother stood over her with frightened eyes. Thomas had ridden into Aurora proper that morning, desperate for help. The town doctor had left 3 weeks earlier to tend to an outbreak of influenza in Bodie, 30 miles north, and wouldn't return for another week at least. The boy had stood in the middle of the dusty Main Street, fighting back tears of frustration, when a massive figure on horseback had approached him. Yates Emerson was not a man easily forgotten. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his worn leather jacket and arms thick with muscle from years of surviving in the high country. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had spent more time under open sky than beneath any roof. He had been a mountain man for 7 years, trapping and hunting in the ranges that stretched between Nevada and California, trading his furs in Aurora twice a year. He was 28 years old and had long ago grown comfortable with solitude. But something about the desperate look in the young boy's eyes had stopped him cold. "What is wrong?" Yates had asked, his voice deep and steady. Thomas had explained through stammering words about his sister, about the fever that would not break, about the sweating and shaking that had only worsened since it started. Yates had listened carefully, his gray eyes focused and intent. "There is a woman 2 valleys over," Yates had said. "A Paiute healer named Silver Dove. She knows medicine that can break a fever like that. I can take you." "I cannot leave my sister," Thomas had said, his voice cracking. "She might die while I am gone." Yates had considered this, then nodded once. "Tell me how to find your cabin. I will go." That conversation had taken place at dawn. Now, as Yates pushed his horse through the sagebrush and scrub pine toward the distant mountains, the sky had begun to darken with ominous clouds. He had visited Silver Dove and explained the symptoms. She had prepared a mixture of herbs and roots, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, with detailed instructions for preparation. The medicine needed to be steeped in hot water and given to the sick woman 3 times within the first day. "This will break the fever," Silver Dove had assured him in her accented English. "But it must be given soon. 3 days with such burning, the body grows weak." Yates had thanked her with silver coins and supplies from his pack, then started the journey back. He knew these mountains as well as any man alive, knew the deer trails and the hidden passes, the places where streams ran cold and clear. Under normal circumstances, he could have made the return journey in 5 hours, but the weather had other plans. The storm rolled in from the west like a dark curtain being drawn across the sky. Yates felt the first drops of rain as he guided his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Bear, down a rocky slope. Within minutes, the drops became a downpour. The spring storm brought not just rain but a cold wind that cut through his jacket like knives. This high in the mountains, even spring storms could turn deadly. Thunder cracked overhead, and Bear whinnied nervously. Yates leaned forward, speaking calmly to the animal even as water streamed down his face. "Easy now. We keep moving. A girl's life depends on it. He thought about the boy's description of his sister, Margaret. The name had stuck in his mind for reasons he could not quite explain. Thomas had spoken of her with obvious love and respect, describing how she had held their small family together after their father's death, how she worked harder than any two men he knew, how she never complained even when things were at their worst. The rain intensified. Yates pulled his hat lower, but water found its way down his collar, soaking his shirt. His fingers grew numb on the reins. The trail became treacherous with mud and loose stones. Twice, Bear stumbled, and twice Yates managed to keep them both upright through sheer strength and balance. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes. Yates knew he should find shelter, wait out the worst of the storm in one of the many caves that dotted these mountains. But every minute he delayed was a minute that Margaret's fever could worsen. Silver Dove's words echoed in his mind. The body grows weak. He pressed on. The wind picked up, bending the pines and sending small branches flying through the air. One struck Yates across the cheek, drawing blood, but he barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the trail ahead, and the precious medicine secured in his saddlebag. Water ran down the mountainside in small rivers now, cutting new channels in the earth. Bear struggled through the mud, his muscles straining with each step. Yates dismounted and led the horse by the reins, his boots sinking ankle-deep with every step. The cold had seeped into his bones, and he felt himself beginning to shiver, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He had survived worse than this. He had weathered blizzards in these mountains that buried trees under 20 feet of snow. He had gone days without food while tracking elk through impossible terrain. He had once fallen through ice into a frozen lake and managed to build a fire with numb fingers before hypothermia could claim him. This storm was brutal, but it would not stop him. Still, as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, Yates felt the toll it was taking. His muscles ached from fighting the wind and mud. His wet clothes clung to him, sapping his warmth. His teeth chattered despite his efforts to stay calm. But the image that had formed in his mind, of a young woman fighting for her life while her brother watched helplessly, drove him forward. He thought about his own family, lost to illness when he was barely 20. His mother and younger sister had both succumbed to scarlet fever during a brutal winter, and he had been too far away, trapping in the mountains, to even say goodbye. By the time he received word and made his way home, they had already been buried. That grief had driven him deeper into the wilderness, away from people and the pain they brought. For years, he had convinced himself that solitude was better, that caring for others only led to heartbreak, but something had shifted in him recently. Maybe it was getting older, or maybe it was simply growing weary of loneliness. When he looked at Thomas's desperate face, he had seen his younger self, helpless and afraid, and he had known he could not walk away. The trail descended into a valley, and for a brief stretch, the trees provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Yates remounted Bear, giving the exhausted horse a moment to rest while still making progress. His hands shook as he gripped the reins, but his resolve never wavered. As he climbed out of the valley and onto the final ridge before Aurora, the storm reached its peak. Rain fell so heavily that Yates could barely see 10 feet ahead. Thunder rolled continuously, one crack blending into the next. Lightning struck a pine tree not 50 yards away, splitting it with a sound like a cannon shot. Bear reared in terror, and Yates held on with all his strength, speaking soothing words that were stolen by the wind. "Almost there," he said, as much to himself as to the horse. "Almost there." The lights of Aurora appeared below, blurred and dim through the sheets of rain. Yates turned bare toward the northeast, where Thomas had said their cabin stood. The landscape had transformed into a gray blur, but Yates's sense of direction never failed him. He counted landmarks even when he could barely see them, gauging his position by the shape of the hills and the angle of descent. By the time the cabin came into view, Yates was shivering so violently that he could barely stay in the saddle. His fingers had gone completely numb, and his muscles felt like they were made of stone. But clutched against his chest, protected by his jacket and his own body heat, the oilcloth package of medicine remained secure. He half fell from Bear's back, his legs nearly buckling when his feet hit the muddy ground. He staggered to the cabin door and pounded on it with what little strength remained. Thomas flung the door open, his eyes widening at the sight of the mountain man soaked to the bone and swaying on his feet. "You came back," the boy breathed. "In this storm, you actually came back." Yates pushed past him into the cabin, water pooling around his boots. "The medicine," he managed through chattering teeth. "Need to prepare it, hot water." The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a stone fireplace where a fire crackled. Yates's eyes went immediately to the figure lying on a bed in the corner. Even from across the room, he could see her shaking beneath a pile of quilts. Thomas rushed to stoke the fire and hang a kettle of water over it. Yates forced his frozen fingers to work, pulling the oilcloth package from inside his jacket. He unwrapped it carefully, relieved to find the herbs and roots dry despite the storm. As he stood by the fire, trying to warm himself enough to stop shaking, he found his gaze drawn to the woman on the bed. Margaret Fletcher was not what he had expected, though he had tried not to form any expectations at all. Her face, flushed with fever, held a delicate beauty that seemed at odds with the calloused hands that lay atop the quilts. Her dark hair spread across the pillow in damp tangles. Even in the grip of illness, there was something striking about her, something that made Yates's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "How long has she been like this?" Yates asked. "Since yesterday evening she has not really woken up," Thomas said, his voice small. "She says things, but they do not make sense." And the shaking got worse. The water began to boil. Yates's hands still shook, but he forced them to be steady as he followed Silver Dove's instructions. He crumbled specific herbs into a tin cup, added the hot water, and let it steep while he counted to 60. The mixture turned a dark amber color and gave off a sharp, medicinal smell. "We need to get this into her," Yates said. "It needs to be warm but not scalding. Help me lift her head." Thomas hurried to his sister's side. Together, they managed to raise Margaret to a semi-sitting position. Her eyes fluttered open, but Yates could see she was not truly conscious. Her lips were cracked and dry. "Margaret," Yates said, his voice gentler than Thomas had heard it before. "You need to drink this. It will help with the fever." He pressed the cup to her lips and tilted it carefully. At first, the liquid just ran down her chin, but then her throat worked and she swallowed. Yates waited, then gave her more. Little by little, she drank the entire cup. "Good," Yates murmured. "That is good." They lowered her back to the pillow. Yates stood, intending to prepare another dose for later, but the room suddenly tilted around him. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, but his legs gave out and he sank to the floor. "Mr. Emerson." Thomas rushed to his side. "I am fine," Yates said, but his words were slurred. He realized dimly that he was not fine at all. Hours in the freezing rain had taken more out of him than he had realized. His body had used every reserve of strength just to get here, and now that he had stopped moving, the cold had caught up with him. Thomas proved more resourceful than his age might suggest. He dragged over a chair and helped Yates into it, positioning it close to the fire. Then he pulled off Yates's soaked jacket and boots, replacing them with dry blankets from a chest. He prepared hot coffee and pressed the cup into Yates's shaking hands. "Drink," Thomas ordered, and despite himself, Yates smiled slightly at being on the receiving end of that command. The coffee helped. The fire helped more. Slowly, the violent shivering subsided into occasional tremors. Yates found he could think more clearly, though exhaustion weighed on him like a physical force. "You should rest," Thomas said. "You can have my bed. I will watch Margaret." "Need to give her more medicine in 4 hours," Yates said. "And again 4 hours after that. I can do it. You showed me how." Yates wanted to argue, but his body had reached its limit. He moved to the bed Thomas indicated, little more than a cot against the far wall, and lay down without removing the blankets wrapped around him. Sleep claimed him almost instantly. He woke to the sound of quiet crying. Disoriented, Yates opened his eyes to find the cabin dark except for the dim glow of the fire. He had no idea how long he had slept. His body ached everywhere, and his throat felt raw, but the dangerous chill had left his bones. The crying continued, and Yates realized it was coming from Margaret's bed. He stood, his muscles protesting, and crossed the cabin. Thomas sat beside his sister, holding her hand while tears streamed down his face. "What is wrong?" Yates asked, fearing the worst. Thomas looked up, and in the firelight, Yates saw that the boy was smiling through his tears. "The fever broke," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just checked, and her forehead is cool. The fever broke." Relief washed over Yates so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled again. He moved closer and placed his own hand on Margaret's forehead. Thomas was right. The terrible heat was gone, replaced by skin that felt merely warm, the natural warmth of life rather than the consuming fire of fever. As if sensing their presence, Margaret's eyes opened. For the first time they were clear and focused. She looked at her brother first, her lips curving into a weak smile. "Thomas," she whispered. "Why are you crying? You were so sick," Thomas said. "I thought I was going to lose you." Her hand squeezed his. "I am all right now. I can feel it. The worst has passed." Then her gaze shifted and landed on Yates. Confusion flickered across her face. "Who are you?" Yates found himself momentarily at a loss for words. In the firelight, with her eyes finally clear and focused on him, Margaret Fletcher was even more beautiful than he had thought. But it was more than her appearance. There was something in her gaze, an intelligence and strength that shone through even in her weakened state. "This is Yates Emerson," Thomas explained. "He is the one who saved you, Margaret. He rode through the storm to get medicine from a healer in the mountains." Margaret's eyes widened. She looked at Yates with an expression that made his heart beat faster. "You did that for me, but you do not even know me." "Your brother asked for help," Yates said simply. "I could not refuse." "The storm," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with concern. "Thomas told me about the storm before I got too sick to understand. It was dangerous. You could have died out there." Yates shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. "I have weathered worse." "But why? Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" It was a fair question, and one Yates did not have a simple answer for. He thought about his mother and sister, about the years of loneliness, about the moment he had looked into Thomas's desperate eyes and known he could not walk away. "Because it was the right thing to do," he finally said. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them in that look, something Yates did not quite understand but felt all the way to his core. "Thank you," she said softly. "I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," Yates replied. "Just get well." Over the next few days, Yates stayed at the Fletcher cabin. He told himself it was only to ensure Margaret's full recovery, to make sure the fever did not return. Thomas needed help with the heavier chores, he reasoned, and someone should hunt fresh meat to help Margaret regain her strength. These were logical, practical reasons for remaining. But in the quiet moments, when he caught himself watching Margaret as she sat by the window with improving color in her cheeks, Yates knew the truth. He stayed because he could not bring himself to leave. Margaret recovered quickly once the fever broke. By the second day, she was sitting up without assistance and eating solid food. By the third, she was insisting on helping with small tasks around the cabin despite both Yates's and Thomas's protests. "I have been lying in that bed for nearly a week," she said firmly. "If I do not move, I will go mad." Yates found himself smiling at her stubbornness. It reminded him of his own mother, who had never let illness or hardship keep her down for long. He watched as Margaret moved around the cabin, noting the confidence in her movements despite her recent illness, the capable way she managed her small household. As Margaret's strength returned, Yates found opportunities to speak with her beyond simple exchanges about her health. He learned that she was not only capable but educated, unusual for a young woman on the frontier. Her father had been a schoolteacher before the lure of silver brought him west, and he had taught both his children to read and write, to cipher numbers, and to think critically about the world around them. "He wanted better for us than he had," Margaret explained one evening as they sat by the fire while Thomas slept. "He thought the mines would provide that. In a way, I suppose they did. We have this land and the cabin he built, but I would trade it all to have him back. How did it happen?" Yates asked gently. Margaret's expression grew distant. "There was a cave-in. They said he died instantly, that he did not suffer. I want to believe that. Thomas was only 12. He needed his father, but instead he got me trying to fill shoes too large for my feet." "From what I have seen, you have done more than fill them," Yates said. "Your brother is a good young man. He is brave and resourceful. That came from somewhere." Margaret smiled, and the sight of it made Yates's breath catch. "Thank you for saying that. There have been many days when I felt like I was failing him, failing both of us. The homestead barely produces enough to get by. I take in sewing when I can, and Thomas does odd jobs in town, but it is always a struggle." "That is the frontier," Yates said. "It is a struggle for everyone." "Even for a mountain man who seems to fear nothing," Yates laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. "Especially for him. You think I live in the mountains by choice alone. The world down here can be harder in many ways than anything nature throws at a man. Is that why you left?" "The world down here." Yates was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. He had spoken more in these past few days than he had in months, maybe years. Something about Margaret made him want to open up in ways he had long ago sworn off. "I left because everyone I loved died," he said finally. "My mother and sister, taken by scarlet fever in the same week. My father had died years before in the war. I had nothing keeping me among people, and being alone in the wilderness seemed preferable to being alone in a town full of folks." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. The touch was simple, meant to comfort, but it sent warmth racing up Yates's arm. "I am sorry. I know what it is to lose family. It leaves a hole that never quite fills." "No," Yates agreed. "It does not." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand still resting on his. Yates was intensely aware of the contact, of how small her hand looked against his calloused palm, of how right it felt. "You should not return to the mountains right away," Margaret said eventually. "You rode through that storm and caught a chill. You need time to recover fully." "I am recovered," Yates protested. "You are not. I hear you coughing at night, and you move more stiffly in the mornings than you did when you first arrived." Yates wanted to argue, but he could not deny the truth of her observations. His body had not fully recovered from the ordeal in the storm. He had pushed himself too hard, and while he would never admit it aloud, he was paying the price. "Stay another week," Margaret said. Let me repay your kindness with proper food and rest. It is little enough compared to what you did for me." Yates knew he should refuse. Every day he stayed, he felt himself growing more attached to this cabin, to Thomas's eager questions about life in the mountains, to Margaret's quiet strength and kindness. He was a solitary man by choice and circumstance, and attachments were dangerous things. But when he looked into Margaret's eyes, he found himself nodding. One more week. The smile she gave him was worth any risk. That week stretched into 2. Yates found himself helping with repairs around the cabin, fixing a section of roof that leaked and replacing worn hinges on the door. He hunted deer and elk, ensuring their smokehouse filled with meat for the coming months. He taught Thomas to track and shoot, passing on skills the boy would need to provide for himself and his sister, and he talked with Margaret. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and philosophy, about the beauty of the mountains and the harshness of frontier life, about dreams and regrets and hopes for the future. Yates discovered that Margaret had a quick wit and a sharp mind, that she could make him laugh with an observation or leave him thinking with a question. He also discovered that he was falling in love with her. The realization came to him one morning as he watched her hanging laundry in the early sunlight. She was humming a tune he did not recognize, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and something about the domestic simplicity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. This was what he had been missing all those years in the mountains. Not just a woman, but this woman. Not just a home, but a life shared with someone who understood him. The thought terrified him. That evening he announced that he would leave the next morning. "I have stayed longer than I intended. My trap lines need checking and I have goods to trade." Margaret's face fell, though she tried to hide it. "Of course. You have your own life to return to. We cannot keep you here forever, no matter how much we have enjoyed your company. Will you come back?" Thomas asked, his disappointment more obvious. "To Aurora, I mean, when you trade your furs." "I will be back in the fall," Yates said. He looked at Margaret as he said it and saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just polite interest. He could not tell. That night, Yates lay awake on his cot, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around him. He knew he was making a mistake by leaving. He knew he should tell Margaret how he felt, should ask if she might feel the same way. But fear held his tongue. What could he offer her? A life in the mountains, isolated and hard. She had responsibilities here, a brother to raise, a homestead to maintain. And he was a man more comfortable with bears and elk than with people and society. No, it was better to leave, to return to what he knew. To forget about dark hair and kind eyes and the way his heart raced when she smiled. He rose before dawn, moving quietly to avoid waking the siblings. But as he gathered his few belongings, he heard movement from Margaret's bed. "You are going to leave without saying goodbye," she said softly. Yates froze. "I did not want to wake you." Margaret stood and crossed to where he stood near the door. In the pre-dawn darkness, with her white nightgown and loose hair, she looked ethereal, like something from a dream. "That is not why," she said. "You are leaving without saying goodbye because goodbyes are hard and you are afraid." "I am not afraid," Yates said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Yes, you are. So am I." Margaret moved closer, close enough that Yates could feel the warmth radiating from her. "I am afraid that if you leave now, you will not come back, that I will spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had just been brave enough to speak." Yates's heart pounded. "Margaret." "I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if she feared losing her courage. "I know that it seems impossible, that you live in the mountains and I have responsibilities here. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. When I thought you might leave without a word, I realized I could not let that happen. Even if you do not feel the same, I need you to know." "How do you feel?" Yates asked, his voice rough. Margaret looked up at him, and in her eyes, Yates saw everything he had been too afraid to hope for. "I am in love with you, Yates Emerson. Completely, impossibly in love with you." The words broke something loose in Yates's chest, some barrier he had built around his heart years ago. He reached out and cupped Margaret's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheeks. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you, burning with fever, and knew I would do anything to save you. I am terrified of it, Margaret. I have been alone for so long. I do not know how to be anything else." "Then we will figure it out together," Margaret whispered. Yates kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. She tasted like hope and home, like everything he had thought he would never have again. Her arms went around his neck and his encircled her waist, pulling her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I will not leave," he said. "Not unless you want me to." "I never want you to leave," Margaret replied. Behind them, they heard Thomas cough pointedly. They turned to find the boy sitting up in his bed, grinning in the growing dawn light. "Finally," Thomas said. "I thought I was going to have to lock you two in a room together." Margaret laughed, her cheeks flushing. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough." "So, does this mean Yates is staying? Because I was really getting used to having another man around here." Yates looked from Thomas to Margaret and back again. "If your sister will have me, I would like to stay, at least for a while until we figure things out properly." "I will have you," Margaret said softly. "For a while or forever, whichever you prefer." "Forever sounds good," Yates replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The following months transformed Yates's life in ways he never could have imagined. He still went into the mountains, but now he returned regularly to the Fletcher cabin, which began to feel more like home than any place had in years. He brought meat from his hunts and money from his trading, helping to ease the financial strain Margaret and Thomas had lived under for so long. He also began to build. Using timber from the mountainside and stone from a nearby creek, Yates expanded the cabin, adding a second room and reinforcing the structure against the harsh Nevada weather. His hands, so long accustomed only to the work of survival, learned a new kind of labor, one motivated by love and the desire to build a future rather than simply endure the present. Margaret bloomed under the new stability. The constant worry that had lined her face began to ease. She smiled more readily and laughed often, particularly at Yates's stories of his adventures in the mountains. She taught him in return, helping to polish manners that had grown rough from years of solitude, reminding him how to exist in society when they made their occasional trips to Aurora proper. Thomas thrived as well, shooting up 3 inches that summer and filling out with muscle from working alongside Yates. The boy, who had been forced to become a man too soon now, had the chance to learn at a steadier pace, with someone to guide him. Yates found himself taking to the role of mentor and surrogate father figure naturally, discovering a patience he had not known he possessed. By the time autumn painted the mountains in gold and red, Yates knew he wanted to marry Margaret. He had known it for months, really, but he wanted to do it properly. He wanted to ask her father's blessing, impossible as that was, and settle the question of their future clearly before all of Aurora. He spoke to Thomas first, one evening when Margaret had gone to town to deliver finished sewing to some of her clients. "I want to marry your sister," Yates said without preamble. "You are the man of this family, and I am asking your permission." Thomas, now 15 and beginning to look more like a young man than a boy, considered the question seriously. "Do you love her more than anything? Will you take care of her, even when things get hard? I will spend every day of my life trying to make hers better." Thomas smiled. "Then you have my permission and my blessing. But you should know, if you ever hurt her, I am getting pretty good with that rifle you have been teaching me to shoot." Yates laughed and clapped the boy on the shoulder. "Fair enough." He asked Margaret the following evening. He had no ring to offer, not yet, though he had plans to have one made from silver nuggets he had found in a mountain stream. But he could not wait any longer. They were sitting by the creek that ran near the cabin, watching the sun set over the western hills. Yates had been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, and Margaret kept glancing at him with concern. "Are you all right?" she finally asked. "You seem troubled." "Not troubled," Yates said. He took her hand in his, studying the way her fingers interlaced with his own. "Margaret, before I met you, I was half a man. I was alive but not living. I survived but did not thrive. You changed everything. You made me want more than just another day. You made me want a future." Margaret's breath caught. "Yates." He shifted to kneel before her hand still held in both of his. "I have nothing to offer you but myself, and I know that is not much. I am rough and unpolished, better with animals than people, but I love you with everything I am or ever hope to be. Will you marry me, Margaret Fletcher? Will you let me spend my life trying to deserve you?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "You already deserve me, you stubborn, wonderful man. And yes, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes." Yates stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and passion that had been building between them for months. The sun completed its descent, leaving them in twilight, two figures joined together against the coming darkness. They were married 6 weeks later in Aurora's small church. The ceremony was simple, attended by Thomas, a few neighbors, and some of the merchants Yates traded with. Margaret wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, and Yates wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, though he drew the line at cutting his hair. As they spoke their vows, Yates felt something he had not experienced in years: complete and utter peace. This woman, this fierce and gentle soul, had agreed to bind her life to his. The miracle of it still stunned him. They spent their wedding night in the expanded cabin, which Yates had transformed with unexpected touches of romance. He had picked wildflowers from the high meadows and placed them in jars around the room. He had laid out furs and blankets to make the bed soft and warm. And he had approached his bride with a tenderness that made Margaret's heart swell. Their joining was sweet and passionate, a celebration of the love that had grown between them. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Margaret traced the scars on Yates's chest, marks left by years of hard living. "Tell me about this one," she said, touching a long scar below his ribs. "A mountain lion disagreed with me about who owned the elk I had just killed," Yates said. "She was a mother protecting her territory. I respected that, but I also was not about to give up my meat. We came to an understanding. An understanding that involved you getting clawed. It involved both of us deciding the elk was not worth dying over. I took part of the meat and left the rest. She left me with a scar and a healthy respect for a mother's fierce love." Margaret kissed the scar gently. "I love you, my wild mountain man. And I love you, my fierce frontier woman." Their first months of marriage were an adjustment for them both. Yates had to learn to share his space and his life after years of solitude. Margaret had to learn to let someone else carry some of the burden she had shouldered alone for so long. They had their disagreements, moments when Yates's stubborn independence clashed with Margaret's strong will, but they always worked through them with honesty and love. Winter came hard that year, with snow piling high around the cabin and temperatures dropping to dangerous lows. But inside, they were warm and content. Yates told stories by the firelight while Margaret sewed and Thomas whittled. They read aloud from books Margaret's father had left, arguing good-naturedly about philosophy and politics. They made plans for the spring, discussing how to improve the homestead and whether they might plant more crops. On the coldest night of the year, when wind howled around the cabin and snow fell so thick they could not see 5 feet beyond the windows, Margaret told Yates she was carrying their child. Yates stared at her, stunned, speechless. Then joy exploded through him so powerfully that he let out a whoop that made both Margaret and Thomas jump. He grabbed Margaret and lifted her, spinning her around until she laughingly demanded he put her down. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "You are going to be a father," Margaret corrected, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "And I am already terrified and thrilled in equal measure." "You will be an amazing mother," Yates said with absolute certainty. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered from sickness in the early months, and the isolation of winter made it impossible to fetch a doctor or midwife. Yates found himself remembering everything Silver Dove had taught him about healing, preparing teas and remedies to ease Margaret's discomfort. He hovered over her constantly, which she found both endearing and exasperating. "I am not made of glass," she told him when he refused to let her carry firewood. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my woman and not my baby," Yates replied stubbornly. "You will let me take care of you or I will go mad with worry." Margaret softened at that, seeing the real fear beneath his protective nature. She took his face in her hands. "I am all right. The baby is all right. You saved me once from fever, remember? Trust that I am strong enough for this." As spring returned and the snow melted, revealing green meadows and rushing streams, Margaret's belly swelled with new life. Yates built a cradle from pine wood, carving it with intricate patterns of mountains and stars. Thomas, excited about becoming an uncle, helped prepare the cabin for the new arrival. When Margaret's time came in early summer, Yates rode at breakneck speed to Aurora to fetch the midwife, a capable older woman named Mrs. Henderson. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. Yates paced outside the cabin, alternating between prayer and panic, while Thomas tried to calm him with the same reassurances he had been given. "She is strong," Thomas said. "She will get through this." Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, a baby's cry split the air. Yates froze, his heart in his throat. Mrs. Henderson emerged a moment later, smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Emerson. You have a son." "A son." Yates stood rooted to the spot for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then he was moving, pushing past the midwife to get to Margaret. She lay in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. When she saw Yates, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart ache. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Yates approached slowly, almost reverently. He looked down at the baby in Margaret's arms and felt his entire world shift. The infant had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were closed, but his little hands waved in the air as if reaching for something. "He is beautiful," Yates whispered. "He is perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Yates's hands, which had killed bears and skinned elk without trembling, shook as he reached for his son. Margaret placed the baby in his arms, showing him how to support the tiny head. The weight was almost nothing, yet it felt like the most precious thing Yates had ever held. "Hello, little one," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am your father, and I promise you I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." The baby opened his eyes briefly, unfocused, but seeming to look directly at Yates. In that moment, Yates felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. He had thought he understood love when he married Margaret, but this was something different, something primal and all-consuming. They named him Nathan, after Yates's father, with the middle name Thomas, after Margaret's brother. Nathan Emerson proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby with strong lungs and an appetite to match. Yates took to fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything, learning to change diapers and soothe a crying infant with surprising skill. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, helped by Yates's insistence that she rest and let him handle the household duties. She watched with tender amusement as her rough mountain man cooed at their baby and sang rough lullabies in a voice meant for calling to horses, not soothing infants. But Nathan seemed to love his father's deep voice, often calming instantly when Yates spoke to him. As Nathan grew from infant to baby, the cabin rang with new sounds. Laughter, crying, the thump of small fists against the cradle rails. Yates found joy in every milestone, from Nathan's first smile to his first attempts at rolling over. He carved toys for his son and told him stories about the mountains, about elk and eagles, about the beauty of the wild places. Thomas, now 16, proved to be a devoted uncle. He helped care for Nathan when Margaret and Yates needed rest, and seemed to relish his role in the growing family. He had shot up to nearly Yates's height and had begun courting a girl in town, the daughter of the general store owner. "You are getting old," Yates teased him one day. "Soon you will be married yourself, starting your own family." Thomas grinned. "Maybe, but I learned from the best how to choose a good woman and treat her right." Life settled into a rhythm that Yates had never known was possible. He still went into the mountains, but never for long, always eager to return to his family. He brought in good money from his trapping and trading, enough that they could expand the homestead further. They bought chickens and a milk cow, planted a larger garden, and even added a few head of cattle. Margaret's sewing business continued to grow, as word spread of her skill with needle and thread. Women from Aurora and the surrounding areas came to her for everything from simple repairs to elaborate dresses for special occasions. She worked during Nathan's naps and in the evenings, with Yates often sitting beside her, maintaining his traps or working leather while they talked about their days. On Nathan's first birthday, they held a small celebration. Thomas came with his sweetheart, Sarah, and a few neighbors stopped by with gifts and well wishes. As Yates watched his son destroy a small cake Margaret had baked, getting more of it on his face than in his mouth, he felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. That night, after everyone had left and Nathan was asleep in his cradle, Yates and Margaret sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Yates replied, his arm around her waist. 2 years ago I was a man alone, convinced that was how I would spend the rest of my days. Now I have a wife I adore, a son who amazes me every day, and a home that actually feels like one. I have been blessed beyond measure." "We both have," Margaret said. "Sometimes I think about that storm, about how you could have decided it was too dangerous, how you could have turned back. My life could have ended that day. Instead, it truly began." Yates kissed the top of her head. "I would ride through 1,000 storms for you. You know that, do not you?" "I do. Just as I know I would wait through 1,000 storms for you to return." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the frontier, crickets chirping, a distant coyote's cry, the soft rustle of wind through the pines. Inside the cabin, Nathan stirred and made a small sound before settling back into sleep. "You want more children?" Margaret asked suddenly. Yates considered the question. "Do you?" "I think I would like Nathan to have siblings. I always wished for more brothers and sisters growing up. It gets lonely being an only child, and Thomas is so much younger than me that we never really played together as children." "Then we will have more children," Yates said. "As many as you want. I will need to build more rooms onto the cabin." Margaret laughed. "Let us start with one more and see how we manage." The following year brought changes to their corner of Nevada. Thomas married Sarah in a ceremony that reminded Yates and Margaret of their own wedding. The young couple moved into a small house in Aurora proper, where Thomas had taken a job as a deputy sheriff, and Sarah helped her father run the general store. Though they were no longer all under one roof, the families remained close, gathering for Sunday dinners and helping each other with the work that frontier life demanded. Margaret became pregnant again, and this time the experience was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect or perhaps simply because her body was stronger. Yates still worried and hovered, but he managed to be slightly less overbearing than during her first pregnancy. Their daughter was born on a crisp autumn day when the aspens had turned gold and the air smelled of approaching winter. The birth was quicker than Nathan's had been, and when Yates held his daughter for the first time, he found himself weeping openly at the miracle of her tiny, perfect form. They named her Emily, after Margaret's mother. Emily had Margaret's dark hair and, as she grew, proved to have her mother's quick intelligence and determination. She also had her father's fearlessness, a combination that led to many heart-stopping moments as she learned to walk and then to climb on everything within reach. Nathan, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, patting her gently and bringing her toys. Yates and Margaret watched their children with joy, marveling at the family they had created. But life on the frontier was never easy for long. The winter after Emily's birth was brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that water froze solid in its buckets, and snow buried the cabin to the windowsills. Yates worked constantly to keep the cabin warm and the animals alive, hunting in weather that would have killed a less experienced man. One particularly bad night, when the wind shrieked like a living thing and the cold seemed to seep through the very walls, Nathan developed a terrible cough. Margaret held him close, trying to ease his breathing, while Yates prepared the same remedies that had once saved Margaret's life. "Will he be all right?" Margaret asked, fear clear in her eyes. Yates thought of that desperate ride through the storm 2 years earlier, of Silver Dove's medicine and Margaret burning with fever. He looked at his son, small and vulnerable in his mother's arms, and felt that same fierce determination rise up in him. "I will not let anything happen to him," Yates said. "I promise you that." He stayed up all night, administering medicine and keeping the fire roaring. He held Nathan when the boy could not breathe properly lying down, his large hands gentle as he supported his son's small body. He sang softly, the same rough lullabies, and told stories about brave young boys who grew up strong in the mountains. By morning, Nathan's breathing had eased. The cough remained, but the dangerous rasp was gone. Yates, exhausted but relieved, finally allowed himself to rest, collapsing into bed beside Margaret with Nathan nestled between them and Emily sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "You saved him," Margaret whispered, "just like you saved me." "He is my son," Yates replied simply. "I would do anything for him, for any of you." The winter eventually released its grip, giving way to spring and then summer. Nathan recovered fully, growing stronger and more adventurous. Emily thrived, a happy baby who smiled easily and rarely cried. The homestead flourished, providing more than enough for their needs and some extra to sell or trade. Years passed, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Nathan grew into a sturdy boy who idolized his father and followed him everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wild. Emily proved to be as tough as her brother, insisting on accompanying them into the mountains despite Margaret's concerns. 2 more children followed, another boy they named Samuel and a girl they named Rose. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, becoming a sprawling structure of wood and stone that stood solid against the Nevada weather. Yates's hair began to show traces of gray at the temples, and lines formed around Margaret's eyes, but they loved each other as fiercely as they had on their wedding day. They still sat together in the evenings, still talked about everything and nothing, still found joy in each other's presence. Thomas and Sarah had children of their own, 3 daughters who visited often and played with their cousins. The families remained close, a tight-knit clan in a harsh land that demanded cooperation to survive. On a warm evening in early summer, 15 years after that fateful storm, Yates and Margaret sat on their porch watching their 4 children play in the yard. Nathan, now 17 and nearly as tall as his father, was teaching 12-year-old Emily to shoot with his old rifle. Samuel, 8 years old, chased after them begging for a turn. Rose, the baby at 5 years old, sat nearby making crowns from wildflowers. "Can you believe it has been 15 years?" Margaret asked, her hand finding Yates's as naturally as breathing. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Yates replied. "I can still remember every detail of that ride, the cold rain, the fear that I might not make it in time. And sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago," Margaret continued. "Like that scared young woman burning with fever was someone else entirely." "She was someone else," Yates said. "We both were. That storm changed everything. It brought me down from the mountains and gave me a life I never knew I wanted." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, watching their children laugh and play in the fading light. "Do you ever miss it? The solitude, the freedom of the mountains?" Yates considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the silence," he admitted. "There is a peace in the high country that cannot be found anywhere else. But I would not trade a single moment of this noise and chaos for all the peaceful mountaintops in the world. You and these children, this life we built together, it is worth more than anything I left behind." "Good," Margaret said, smiling. "Because I am not done with you yet, Yates Emerson. I plan to grow old with you, to watch our children have children of their own, to sit on this porch when we are both gray and wrinkled and remember the day a mountain man rode through a storm to save my life, and ended up giving me everything I ever wanted." "I was the one who was saved," Yates replied softly. "You healed more than just the fever, Margaret. You healed a broken man and showed him how to live again." They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside the cabin, the life they had built together continued in 1,000 small ways. In the cradle that had held all 4 children, now waiting for grandchildren. In the books on the shelves and the carefully mended quilts on the beds. In the smell of bread baking and the sound of children's laughter. In the simple, profound miracle of a family sustained by love. Nathan called out something, and Emily laughed in response. Samuel finally got his turn with the rifle, and Rose ran to show her parents the flower crown she had made. The moment was ordinary and perfect, exactly the kind of moment that made up a life well lived. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Yates pulled Margaret close and kissed her forehead. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, had faced challenges that would have broken lesser people. But they had survived and thrived, their love growing stronger with each passing year. The mountain man who had once preferred solitude to company had found his true home not in the wilderness, but in the heart of a strong, brave woman. And the young woman who had nearly died from fever had been reborn into a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. Together, They had built something that would last long after they were gone. A family, a legacy, a love story that would be told around fires for generations to come. The story of a desperate ride through a storm, of medicine delivered just in time, of two souls who found each other when they needed it most and chose to build a life together, despite every obstacle in their way. As the night deepened, and the children were called inside to prepare for bed, Yates and Margaret remained on the porch a moment longer, holding hands and watching the mountains that had brought them together. Those peaks stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the passage of time and the endurance of love. In the distance, thunder rumbled, promising rain by morning. But inside the cabin, all was warm and bright and safe. And as Yates and Margaret finally stood to go inside, they did so together, as they had done everything for the past 15 years and would continue to do for all the years to come, partners in every sense of the word, bound by love that had survived its first test in a terrible storm and had only grown stronger with time. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic rescue, though it had begun that way. It was something better, a story of everyday courage, of choosing love over loneliness, of building a life together one day at a time. It was the story of a mountain man who had ridden through a storm and returned soaked and shivering, but who had gained far more than he had risked. It was the story of a woman who had been healed in body and soul, who had found in her rescuer not just a savior but a partner, a lover, a friend. It was, in the end, a story of home. And as the door closed behind them and the lamplight glowed through the windows, casting warm squares of light into the Nevada night, that home stood as testament to the transforming power of love, as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves.